Does anybody recognize what this picture is? No, but that's good because we'll be returning to the picture in a moment. Okay, so I'll be making 4 points. 1, human progress comes from innovations and their diffusion and adoption. Point number 2, innovations are an act of rebellion against the status quo. Third point is that status quo usually wins. This is called the Cardwell's law, unless a new challenge, some sort of external challenge, makes the status quo lose. And finally, innovation or progress requires interjurisdictional competition, which is to say that through competition between different jurisdictions, states, localities, etc., you want to gain as much freedom as possible for the innovators. So, human progress comes from innovations. What do we mean by innovations? I really mean right across the spectrum. Institutional innovation, movement from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, that's an innovation. Movement from democracy, such as Athenian democracy, to liberal democracy, that's an innovation. Because in Athenian democracy, Socrates could be condemned to death by a majority of vote. In liberal democracy, we actually do care about individual rights. Legal innovation, movement from privus legus, privilege, to equality before the law. French Revolution, 1789. People rise up against the nobility because nobility has all sorts of rights, but they don't actually have to pay taxes. Privus legus really means legislation which is created for a specific group of people, and obviously a movement from there to equality before the law matters. Financial innovations, bills of exchange, instead of carrying vast sums of money in your pocket or in a bag when you are trying to do trade between Rome and Egypt. Technological innovations, that's very easy. Horsepower versus steam, or hoe versus combine harvester. Scientific, Aristotelian versus Newtonian ethics. Aristotle believed that birds flew because it was in their nature, rocks fell because it was in their nature. Newton comes along and says, no, all of that happens because of gravity. Medical, miasma, this is what our ancestors believed, that there was such a thing as poisoned air, and that's what caused people to become sick, obviously overtaken by germ theory of disease by Louis Pasteur in the 1860s. And cultural innovations, such as replacement during the entitlement of reason for superstition, and even ethical innovations. Dehumanization of women, Jews, gays, what have you, and replacement of that kind of attitude with a notion of equal dignity. Now, here's the thing. We have always innovated as human beings, but progress was incredibly slow. So the first primitive Stone Age tools appeared 2.5 million years ago. And by the time that you get to Acheulean stone tools, which are just a little bit more refined, it takes 1 million years in between. And the first metal age comes 6,000 years BC. So really getting from most primitive Stone Age tools to the first metal age, it takes 2.5 million years. This is not exactly a very fast scope of progress. Now, that doesn't mean that progress didn't happen. There were past efflorescences, as Jack Goldstone calls them, of innovation, or temporary peaks followed by stagnation and decline. There were certain societies in certain point in time that were actually quite innovative for a limited period of time. Those include classical Greece, Roman Empire, Gupta Empire in India, Abbasid Caliphate, the so-called Golden Age of Islam, Song Dynasty, which gives us paper money, gunpowder, and the compass, Renaissance Florence under Lorenzo de' Medici, Dutch Golden Age, and so forth. Now, all of them have come and all of them have gone. Today, we are living in the modern era, so-called modernity. Modernity which starts in northwestern Europe, Holland, and the United Kingdom in the second half of the 18th century, and then spreads to western offshoots, places like the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And this era of modernity is characterized by rapid and sustained innovation. Sustained doesn't do a lot of work there, because for the last 200 years we've been innovating really at a steady rate, and we've been innovating a lot and very rapidly. And it is characterized not just by economic or technological progress, but also by moral progress. We treat each other better than our ancestors used to. Why did it happen and will it continue? So in order for progress to continue, if you think it's a good thing, we need to figure out why it happened. We have to diagnose the reasons why human progress happened, because that's the only way that then we can derive lessons from it and keep progress going into the future. Now, there are popular but often false explanations of human progress, and then there are unknown or little known reasons for progress. And I'm going to start with the popular ones, which are also wrong ones. First one, worker exploitation. Marx believed that because of competition between different companies, profit would be shrunk to zero, and consequently, if capitalists wanted to make money, they would have to squeeze it out of the workers, which led to exploitation of workers. Workers would become poor. Poor people would become poorer, rich people would become richer. Well, that can't explain human progress. That cannot explain the great enrichment, because during Marx's own lifetime, incomes per capita of English workers have risen by 132%. Protestant work ethic probably cannot explain human progress, because Catholic Ireland is now the most prosperous country in Europe. We have tremendous prosperity in Confucian China, and of course Shinto religion didn't keep Japan from developing. Colonialism cannot explain why Switzerland is rich, but Portugal and Spain are relatively poor. In fact, colonialism is the reason for Spain being relatively poor. The king, having had access to all that money from Latin America, didn't have to compromise with Parliament. He had independent source of revenue, and consequently the institutional development of Spain has been underdeveloped relative to Britain. Also, it led to Dutch disease, meaning production of goods was so expensive in Spain because of all that access to gold that actually Spanish economy collapsed, and Spain went bankrupt in spite of all that gold 8 times in the 17th century. Slavery cannot explain modern progress because there were slave societies since the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago. But no society, no Egyptians, Greeks, Persians, Romans, Han, Aztecs, Ottomans, Mongols, Dahomey, Ashanti, Zulu, whatever, none of them has become rich. So slavery cannot explain modern progress. Natural resources, they were always there. So why didn't our ancestors 100 or 200 years ago, or 2 million years ago, become rich? Indeed, why did Soviet Union, which had all sorts of resources, remain poor, whereas Hong Kong, which doesn't have any resources except for a port or a harbor, become immensely rich? And of course, geography cannot explain. Because people say, okay, well, Europe had a lot of rivers which enabled transport, and it had good soil, and therefore it became rich. But Latin America, South America, has a lot of rivers and good soil, and yet it didn't become rich. So popular reasons are out there, but they are very often wrong. Probable reasons. Well, probable reasons include, and these are just examples. Please don't think that this is an exhaustive list. These are just examples. Institutional legal innovations. For example, greater restraints on government. In order for King William and Mary to take over in Britain as king and queen, they had to sign certain restrictions on their rights. This is the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which deposed James II. Greater accountability of government. We are talking here about the Great Reform Act of 1832, which massively expanded franchise in Great Britain. But in the United States, in 1789, we have franchise. Franchise which is limited to men, usually white men, and usually free men of property. But even though the franchise was still heavily restricted in the United States was still the most democratic country in the world until 1848. So that gives you a sense of where the rest of the world was. Equality under the law, again, US Constitution, 1787, and the rights of man during the French Revolution. These are some of the steps, or rather, these were the 2 very important events that enshrined equality under the law, as opposed to privilege. We have economic and financial innovations. Examples include the statute of monopolies, where King James I is deprived of the right to give out monopolies. Marianne Tupy will be given the right to import wool. Steven Pinker will be given the right to export salt. Okay? Statute of monopoly prohibits that. Anybody can do business. Destruction of guilds. This was driven primarily by the Napoleonic Wars. Guilds restricted your access to the market. If you wanted to make shoes, you first had to be an apprentice. You had to work for a very long time. You were a member of the guild, and that's what kept prices of shoes high. By elimination of guild, people can enter any business, so that stimulates domestic economy. And of course, you have limited liability company. This is important because if you go out of business, if your ship sinks on the way from the Far East to Europe. You no longer lose all the money that you have invested, maybe your house, and maybe you end up in prison, debtor's prison. No, it's a limited liability company. You only lose your investment. And of course, Amsterdam Stock Exchange, both happen in 1602. Another set of probable reasons. We have cultural innovations, wars of religion. In my homeland, in 1618, half of the population believed that Christianity, best interpreted by the Pope, was the thing. The other half believed that Christianity, as interpreted by by Martin Luther, was the thing. And so we proceeded to kill each other for the next 30 years, thus killing every third European in Central Europe. Now, the wars of religion lead to the collapse of one moral authority, which is the Catholic Church. You no longer have one source of truth. There is greater competition of ideas. Protestants feel that they have to present more ideas of better quality, or rather arguments of better quality, and Catholics have to respond to it with better arguments. And they often actually use reason, or what they think are reasonable arguments, in order to prove whether Catholics or Protestants are right or wrong. But the bottom line is that nobody knows anymore who is right, and this is important. Second, enlightenment. Stephen has written a book about it. Obviously, greater reliance on reason, greater toleration, which actually springs from the war of religion, but then also leads to greater toleration of different ideas. Skepticism of authority, that again is partially a result of the wars of religion. Greater individualism. A woman is no longer considered to be just a wife of somebody. A man is not considered to be just son of somebody. People are considered as individuals. Herbert Spencer talks about it, who are entitled to the pursuit of happiness. Happiness understood not in terms of momentary feeling of being well, but rather self-fulfillment given your God-given abilities. And a recognition that knowledge is cumulative. And once you believe that knowledge is cumulative, then that, of course, leads to the possibility that there is going to be progress. And that also leads to optimism about the future. So there is this virtuous cycle going on. Europe, therefore, ends up, relatively speaking, this is very important, relatively speaking, much more open, inquisitive, irreverent. It uses experimentation and toleration, and that is the cultural innovation that I maintain was partly responsible for progress. Now, we also have ethical innovations. For example, as Deidre McCloskey explains in her trilogy, Bourgeois Trilogy, there is a change in individual attitudes to trade, entrepreneurship, and innovation. Innovation, since the get-go, is always considered to be negative. Herodotus talks about, which is the first historian, talks about Cyrus the Great complaining that one of his satraps did him an innovation, novotera, by which he means he was betrayed, because innovation was equivalent to betrayal. It was a betrayal of status quo, as I'm going to explain later. And of course, another ethical innovation is the expanding circle of sympathy, as Peter Singer, in fact, has said. Much greater equality under the law given to women and Jews, specifically in the late 18th and in the 19th centuries. Finally, we have technological innovations, such as improved design and navigation tools that enable the voyages of discovery. Why were they important? Vasco da Gama sails around the eastern coast of Africa and finds people living on the equator. Why is that noteworthy? Because Aristotle claimed that equator was far too hot for anybody to live there. And so Europeans now have a proof that Aristotle can be mistaken. Columbus discovers America, and Aristotle has never talked about America. He has described the world, but America was missing. So from that, Europeans derive two things. One, Aristotle doesn't know everything, and some of the things that Aristotle thinks he knows are actually false. That undermines the power of ancient texts, and that is very important because that provides scope for modern texts, better texts. Telescope. Galileo undermines the geocentric view on the world and related religious dogmas. For example, if Earth is in the center of the universe and man, as a consequence, is the most important thing, that leads to all sorts of secondary consequences. Like, for example, if a human being is really in the center of the universe, if it is God's creation, then perhaps you cannot undertake certain medical procedures, such as dissection. It is when a human being becomes sort of demystified that you can undertake different medical procedures. Also, people had all sorts of weird beliefs that were derived from geocentrism, such as, for example, that earth, water, fire, and air were analogous to the four humors that Galen talks about. And really, it is when geocentrism disappears that we have a much greater reliance on experimentation and so forth. And printing press allows dissemination of this knowledge throughout Europe and beyond. We have scientific innovations. Francis Bacon departs from deductive reasoning and embraces inductive reasoning based on observation and experimentation. Isaac Newton, very important, Principia Mathematica, believed that nature can be mastered through discovery and understanding of its immutable and therefore predictable laws. This is a result of him discovering gravity. And we have merging of propositional and prescriptive knowledge. The best way to explain it is by looking at vaccines. When Jenner develops vaccines, he's got prescriptive knowledge. He knows that by taking a pus from a cow and giving it to a child, he is going to prevent transition of smallpox. But he doesn't know why it happens. That's the propositional part of knowledge. He's got prescriptive knowledge. He knows how to inoculate people, but he doesn't have propositional knowledge. Propositional knowledge only arrives when Pasteur develops germ theory of disease. And when you combine propositional and prescriptive knowledge, then you have a huge advancement in knowledge and science. So, final part of my talk, will modernity persist or will it peter out? Joel Mokyr mentions that every innovation is an act of rebellion which upsets political, economic, religious elites with vested interest in the status quo. Past efflorescences of innovation have been stamped out by the threatened elite, which reasserted its authority, but that didn't happen for the first time in modern Europe. Why not? In the 18th century, most of the world is consisting of empires. You've got the Ottoman Empire, you've got the Russian Empire, you've got the Mughal Empire, you've got the Chinese Empire. When you have big countries, big empires, the ruling elite is usually not concerned about being attacked and subsumed or defeated by external enemies. They are worried about enemies from within. They are worried about internal or domestic instability, and consequently they clamp down on domestic instability. The only place which doesn't have an empire, which is not united, of course Europeans have external empires, but they don't have a domestic empire. In fact, Europe is constituted of hundreds of different countries and statelets and principalities who are at each other's throats constantly trying to defeat each other. So in Europe, the incentive structure of the European elites is exactly flipped. They are so worried about being conquered and subsumed by competing states that they are willing to permit greater internal innovation, greater internal freedom in order to generate more economic growth, in order to generate better militaries, in order to generate more money to keep those militaries, and so forth. So, in Europe, intellectual life remained pan-European. You had the Republic of Letters, and people all over Europe exchanging information and writing to each other in a common lingua franca, which was Latin, later replaced by French, and emigration was common. So if you became toxic in your home state, you could always emigrate to a different state and vice versa. That's how Voltaire ends up in Britain. And that really means that the interjurisdictional competition, in my view, was key. Now, I'm not saying that Brussels or Washington or the United Nations are useless. What I am saying is that when you centralize too much power in the center, it can lead to negative consequences, such as centralized power in Beijing enabled Xi to basically depart from the previous decades of economic growth and continuous liberation. He figured out that liberation went too far, that China was becoming too free, and consequently he decided that in order to preserve the monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party, he would basically have to undermine growth and spread of wealth, etc. It was worth it to him because his primary objective is to preserve the communist monopoly on power. This is Voltaire actually lecturing Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick the Great, in his memoir of the House of Brandenburg, which he wrote in 1740s, notes about Louis XIV, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Edict of Nantes was passed in France by Henry IV, allowing Protestants freedom of worship. And Frederick the Great, thinking about that period, thinking about Louis XIV revoking Edict of Nantes, says Louis XIV drove out 500,000 of his subjects. It was one of those horrid political blunders. It ruined his commerce and depopulated the finest provinces in his kingdom. He would have done better to employ those brave and laborious citizens against his enemies. From that experience and from the study of history and from the fact that he is a leader of a small country constantly at war with his neighbors, he derives a certain set of moral principles, a certain philosophy, which then leads to certain practical outcomes. In his essay on the form of government and the duty of sovereigns, he said, "Would not one have to be demented to suppose that men said to one of their number, 'We are raising you above us because we like being slaves, and so we are giving you power to direct our thoughts as you like'? On the contrary, what they said was, 'We need you to maintain laws which we wish to obey, to govern us wisely, to defend us. For the rest, we require that you respect our liberty.'" And Prussia, believe it or not, in the 18th century was known as the freest nation in Europe. What are the practicalities? How do I prove that what I was talking about, interjurisdictional competition, was actually happening? Here is what the biographer of Frederick the Great says. Prussian consulates became, in effect, recruiting offices, publicizing Frederick's enticing manifestos, advancing money for the journeys and organizing itineraries. The prospect of land settlement, grants, free seed, livestock, equipment, personal freedom, and exemption from military service was sufficiently alluring for around 250,000 immigrants who have entered Prussia during the course of Frederick's reign, thus actually enhancing the power and independence of the Prussian monarchy. So that is essentially my basic take on what has happened. Innovation is incredibly important, but innovation happens best when you have competition between jurisdictions so that the status quo power, whatever it is, be it priesthood, be it a political caste or whatever else, cannot snuff it out. Thank you very much.